Did you know one of the most sought after skill sets to be on your resume in 2025 is storytelling? And some of you are thinking, really? I thought it was something else. Starts with an A, ends with an I. Not that? Well, that's on there too. But people are surprised to hear that storytelling is such a commodity, such a sought after skill set today. Why is that? What has happened in the story world that now businesses are that interested in that skill set? Because I thought it was just for children's books and movies. How does it fit into this conference? It comes back to this event. Neuroscience found that we are wired for story. It's down to this point where we go, you know what? We think in story. It's hardwired in our brain. It's how we make strategic sense of the otherwise overwhelming world around us. So how does that play out in our organizations today? How do we make use of this, that we're wired for story? Well, essentially what's happening right now is people realize, okay, I kind of get it. I've kind of heard that I need to tell people a story. And we use it as a communication strategy. In other words, I'll do the work. I don't want to have to think about stories. And then at some point, I have to tell someone what I've done. So I'll work with John or someone. They'll help me put it into a story. That's the direction of the path of how we do that now. And that's the focus. So it could be past work that you've done. It could be some work about the future, so you want to put it in a story for investors. But that's the focus. That's kind of where things are at right now in the business world. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Let's say that an entrepreneur approaches me and says, John, help me. I have a journey. I've built this product in a company. I'm supposed to communicate it in a story. How would I do that? And I would go, oh, got it. I've got a bunch of questions. I'm going to start with just a few, and we'll go from there. First one is, what were you doing before you launched your first venture? And they'll tell me. I might be recording it. Okay, good answer. And then I'll ask, how did you initially identify the need or opportunity? And they'll say, okay. They'll walk through that. And then I'll ask another question. I'll say, what key insights were discovered from your competition analysis? Oh, good question, and they answer that. And then I'll ask them, did your winning idea emerge at first, or were there iterations? And they'll give me some answers around that. And then I'll ask, was there ever a point where you felt like giving up, and if so, what kept you going? And then I'll ask, what key data or testimonials indicated version 1 was done? And after we get that answer, I'll say, okay, now in production, what operational metrics do you watch? And we put that together, and in today's world, I easily just pull that into a prompt with ChatGPT, give me a summary based on these paragraphs, and we have a wonderful story already that fast. I'll have additional questions based on this, but that quickly, that's how this would come together. But I usually get this question. They'll say, wait a minute, what is this? They'll call it a cheat sheet. What is this cheat sheet you're using? How did you know these questions? And to ask them, and what is the circle? I love it when people are curious and start asking questions about it. And of course, we've all learned that when you're talking to someone who's not in your field, you try to communicate in their language, how they would understand it. So I might say, well, picture a spreadsheet. And there's this row of empty cells you know you have to fill in. And above that is a header row. It tells you what needs to go in it. And instantly, we're connected. We're communicating. They get it. That's basically, there must be some type of a template. And that works for about 5 seconds. And they go, yeah, but this is a circle. So then I go, oh, this is what you're looking for. You've heard a story is a line. A story is a beginning, middle, and end, okay? And now we're connected as far as where most people start, what they've heard about with stories. And this is a basic model that people use for stories that still works today. It's as old as Aristotle. So we've built upon it. This is another version of that used at movie studios. This is their model for making a movie. Once upon a time, every day, but one day, because of that, and because of that, and because of that, until finally, and ever since then, and that's the model of their story, and you can fill in a movie. Another variation you might have heard of called an arc. It's not just a line. There's an exposition. What were you doing before something happened? We call it rising action to a climax and then falling action until finally a resolution. So these are models that are out there, have been out there for a while. You might have seen some of these that you could ask questions about and fill them in as well. There's also a cyclic way of thinking, a different way of drawing it. A story where you start at the top, a beginning, and then you move down into the trough of disillusionment, and then finally back up and there's an ending. So this is based on emotional states because everything's fine until something's not working, and then I'm moving down into this emotional level that I don't want to stay at. Well, when you're teaching innovation, it doesn't work too well to say, okay, today class we're going to focus on the trough of disillusionment. It actually works better to turn this cycle around. And picture the story starting at the bottom of a cycle. It's like gravity. See, we settle into a routine. So this is based on energy, not emotion. This is based on the energy it takes to transform. We settle into a routine at the beginning, but when we have the energy and desire to transform and go up and over to transform, we're entering not into a trough of disillusionment, but into a realm of possibility. And that's a much better place to be in creativity as you're going through innovation. And then ending with the end of the story, but it's a cycle and we'll go again. Let's take this view of story and apply it to a model that maybe you've heard of, hero's journey. So the hero's journey is given to us as some steps, but we can map those steps onto this cycle and see that it starts at the bottom, low energy, status quo. We go through a call to adventure, a refusal of the call because it looks like it's too big, but then I have assistance, and I can have assistance, and I can practice, and I can prepare, but at some point we cross a threshold and we start reaching trials and approaching the big ordeal that we're approaching. And then the reward after, but there's still more. There's a road back, a new life, and finally we return transformed. So it's not just that we did something, we became something different through that journey. That's what makes it a story. But again, we see that we come back to rest in because of gravity really, when you think of it that way, in a new routine, and the sequel makes the cycle. There'll be a sequel, or at work, we call that version 2, next project, and we go again. So let's take this into the work environment. You can time me, I think I can do this in 1 minute. We had successful operations at work, but we knew more competition was coming. We discovered a new idea that we could incorporate and created a new vision. Development took some time, but it all came together. Now operations are even better. So at work, that's really what we're doing. We're telling stories, but you were actually in the story when you were doing it. As I said earlier, I love it when there's curiosity and people will ask me at this point, like, yeah, but where did these steps come from? Okay, let's dive in even deeper. So it's really helpful to understand the underlying sort of psychological mindsets that are driving all of this based on workability beliefs. You've probably heard this, it either works or it doesn't work. There's another workability belief called could work. That's a place our mind goes when we're in a project or working towards something. So you take those and then you work with 3 response modes of reactive, questioning, and reflective. That's what you thought was at the end of the sentence and it was just a punctuation mark. It's really just the way that we're thinking about it. And it lets us create these. So automation means does work reactive. Does work reactive is a mindset I believe it works. I don't have to think about it. I'm just in a reactive mode, sort of mindless, not mindful. And automation means automaticity or routine, okay? It doesn't necessarily mean machine automation. It doesn't necessarily mean AI automation or robotic automation. Automation just means does work reactive. I mean, some of us today have already done 10 things without having to think about it. So that's what this state of mind is. Then we move into disruption. Something might happen, won't work reactive, and we have a lot of things planned for that. That's why we have help desk. Okay, try rebooting. We go through that. If that's not working, we go into investigation. Now it won't work questioning, and I'll start to actually dive into it. And then we move into questioning, but could work. That's what ideation is doing. And I'm in ideation. I'm in a could work mindset. And then eventually I want to cross that line. If you're leading change, if you're a leader of change or innovation, it's about making sure people can cross the lines, because at some point you say could work as a question, and then one day you have to be able to say could work as a period. Here's our plan. It's about moving people through the story. And eventually it works, affirmation, and then we're back into a routine. So you might have noticed as you look at these psychological states, there's two different sides doing completely different things on the top and the bottom. On the bottom, I call that the half pipe sometimes because of snowboarding, if you've seen that. So we can basically compare what the top half and bottom half's for. Top half's for transformational change. The bottom half is when we're just in some transactional change. The top half is creativity and innovation, and the bottom half is compliance and execution. The top half is for thinking slow and unsupervised AI, and the bottom half is for thinking fast and supervised AI. The top half is for projects, research and development, and the bottom half is routines and operations. And it's about this point when you really understand this is what we're wired for, this is what we're doing, people will say, wouldn't it be nice, like sometime in the future, if we just built and designed organizations around how we actually think and learn? And I have to tell them, yeah, we did that. It was in the 1950s. Well, the organization chart itself would let you work for 20 years in one side or the other and retire with one type of thinking or another. Where in research and development, they never had errors or mistakes. They had learnings. They had tests. In operations, they had mistakes and errors, okay, and failures. And over time, we know that we don't get to live in different worlds anymore. Managers today know that they're going from one meeting to the next. One meeting, it's an operational setting. Here's how my metrics are looking today. The very next meeting is a transformational meeting about a project, something you're putting into place. And we've merged those two worlds. And a lot of the language from the operations world has merged in with it. And that's why we have people talking about failures and accepting failures. We were never meant to use that language, and they were always separate back when we kept them separate. As we move into our new world with AI first means whatever the project is, we're going to be asking, how can AI help? Where does it go? So we'll have the same type of thing happening, same learnings happening, approach for how to approach our work based on those two sides with transformational versus transactional, knowledge exploration versus knowledge exploitation. And you might have noticed if you've seen the latest research on even the right and left brain hemispheres, that the language that describes the key differences, possibility versus certainty, and there's a bunch of other terms, they also align directly to what we're talking about in story. And it's about here where someone will say, okay, wait, okay, I was curious and now we're in really deep. I thought this was going to be a little simpler. And I'll say, okay, I'm only going to give you one definition, but this might help. I want to introduce you to a term, narrative intelligence. A term that originated at MIT Media Lab, not far from here, maybe walking distance for some of you. to explore the intersection of AI and literary theory. It is the ability to understand narratives from different perspectives, craft and tell compelling stories with internal consistency, remember that term, and describe the cognitive and emotional patterns within stories. There's longer definitions. This one's enough for now. So let's take a look at some of these patterns. Most of our patterns have to do with us getting back to routine. I was just doing my thing, something happened. When I find myself in disruption, I don't really want to transform anything. I just want someone to get me back to it working. That's what help disks are for. Try rebooting, have a flat tire. There's companies that'll come out and get you back on the road. In fact, when I researched this one pattern, I found most business models are based on this. Most business models are based on this one idea. Now, there's another way of looking at it. It's like someone's already figured it out and I just want the answer. Okay, now we have LLM companies that this is their primary model. Just look it up. I don't want to figure it out. Someone's done that. Just give me the answer. So you're getting the idea that we're kind of mental misers. We really are resisting the transformational change. We're trying to see if we can just stay where we're at. At some point, something happens, there's an error, like a pilot error, but we don't have a disruption reactive capability to identify it immediately. So we need some time to look into it. And in some cases, as soon as we go, oh, I know what this is now, I can just move right back into routine because I already know what to do with that. We're just going to add that to training. We already have simulation on that. So we have answers. We're still going to try to just get back into our routine and just add a little bit. But every once in a while, it's not pilot error. After enough planes crash, we need to redesign the cockpit, the process. Okay, we need to go through the whole thing and come up with something else, test that, and put a new routine into place. And finally, we're through a transformational story. So a colleague of mine uses this to describe the Boeing 737 MAX project. They released all of the emails and all the project documents just for learning purposes. They wanted people to learn from it. So after analyzing it, he goes through the story of it. We have plenty of procedures, metrics, policies in place, and then we have a couple of accidents, and it was because there's two that led them to finally investigate and say, okay, we know what system was causing that, and it will require us going through a transformation, looking at new code and so forth, and then looking through the project and all of the people involved. And this time, you can look through the emails and the communications of all the people, many people on a project, and see that these two green boxes were communications and sentiment analysis of working with regulators. And yet sentiment analysis within the team were negative sentiment. So it's an interesting thought when we think of data that maybe large projects could use sentiment analysis across document and communications as part of the data to give us an early warning system. Eventually, we did get the bugs worked out, and we're flying again. So where do ideas fail? When you look at NTSB reports and other accident reports, you'll see the same terms over and over. And those terms fall at specific places in your story. And other people have started to ask, if we can ask these questions after a project, what if we started asking them before the project? If we already know the story and where those places are, and we've started calling that a pre-mortem. You know what that means, don't you? It means this guy was right all along. Carl Jung told us a long time ago, you are in a story, whether you know it or not. So what would that look like in our organization? That would flip this arrow around. That would mean storytelling is not just a communication strategy, it's our operational strategy. This is storytelling in now time, what I call story thinking. And one of the ways that you can think about this working is simply with prompts. As you're talking or writing what you want to do. You're in a story, you're describing it, and it's happening. You're creating the working environment as you go. So here's a quick example. Linda, remember Linda? Yeah. Marketing manager? Yeah, she wants to track the results of her latest social media campaign. Okay. She needs a script to fetch the number and likes of a specific comments and post for a social media platform API. And I go, okay, you do know, as you enter my office, there was a sign there reminding you that the microphone is always on, right? Because AI is listening and it's always helping as part of our dialogue. So it's just notified me that it has already posted that to Linda's portal. So this is the kind of world we're moving to. We are a language story first organization. When we say AI first, it's really story first, because it's the language of the story that we're in, that we're describing, that's being generated. So how would you measure your organization from a story standpoint? There's plenty of KPI that we know of. They happen at specific places of your story to take key measurements and keep track of in a individual or an organization level for the KPI that you're looking for. You might have commitment on the team. You might do that through surveys, but then you have process. You might see how many people are certified in process. You can see that you deliver, but deliver doesn't mean people want the results, and you get the results back. That doesn't mean you've learned anything. So these are all happening in your story. There's a way to think of it that way and measure it directly instead of, well, I do this other thing and then I'll tell the story. You're actually in the story, and you can start thinking about how to work in the story and measure the story that you're in. That's at an organizational level. You might say, well, maybe it's our leadership team. Well, leaders obviously need to have a lot of attributes. They need to have vision and courage and patience and composure and resilience, and it's a list, right? No, it's not a list. These are very specific things that happen in very specific places in the story. And sometimes without knowing that, a leader might use or overcompensate a particular thing, like let's say they learned that composure is leadership. And they can overplay that when the team is trying to do ideation, and you can work against yourself. Or you might also find out for your entire leadership team that everyone has a component of abilities to lead through the entire story, but what's the number one thing that they have? What's their benchmark? What's their number one strength on the team? And then you realize there's no one on the team that walks in every morning looking through the lens of ideation. That's a zero. And it might be an indication of what's happening on your team. This is a report that came out a while back after a several decades study of what we call leadership development from the Leadership Quarterly. And they concluded by saying present practices are primitive. There's a lot of ideas about leadership, about making sure that I'm standing straight, speaking up, okay, not changing my mind, that would look weak. We've got all of these things about leadership. Really, it has nothing to do with leadership. If you're leading, that means you're leading change. If you're leading change, you're moving people through a story. And you might want to look at this from an individual level. Maybe it's the individual personality scores, because maybe you have a right brain person working in a left brain job, and vice versa. Okay, so the idea is that there's many other ways you can do this. I want to just introduce the idea that we think in terms of models, and we'll work using the model that I use, and then we'll tell a story. And as we realize we're in that story, AI first is actually becoming story first, because we're talking through it, that we can start to look at story as the context of the data, look at story as the model. And I still, at this point, will have people say, yeah, but I already have the models that we use, and we're certified in them, and we know how to use those. We'll just stop there. And I go, you mean these models? You might recognize some of these. You might be certified in some of these. And we've compared story against even more than 50 change models. I'll show you some examples where it works and where it doesn't work, where there's alignment and it makes sense because it does map to a story, and where it doesn't. Now, one of the things about this list is you'll notice that they're usually prescriptive. In other words, do these things in this order. That's the way we were given models. Most of them are also maybe a half a century old. Let's take this one, for example. Anyone a project manager certified in PMI steps? If you are, you will have been told that everything you do falls under the category of initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, controlling, and closing. That's it. Those are the steps. It's a great advanced organizer as your mind's getting ready for where all the information is going to hang. It's going to hang under all of those. Why does it kind of work? Why do people go to that? Why can people be project managers when they follow those steps? Because when you map those steps against a story, it completes the story. So this is a good example of where you can do that. Here's another one. What do we really mean by agile in an organization? It really just means not linear. It means the arrowheads have there's two arrowheads on the arrows. You can go forward, design something, test it, go back and develop it again, go back and maybe redesign it, and go back and forth as you're moving through the story. You're not moving in a linear fashion. Agile just at its root means non-linear, and people have built other things on top of that, stand-up procedures and so forth, which really are not the root definition. So this is another good example because we certainly do move through stories in an agile way. Let's take a look at some examples where they're not exactly aligned. So this is the marketing funnel. Every one of our companies want people to move through our marketing funnel. And that's what we call it, at least from a measurement standpoint. These steps that we were given a long time ago, the marketing psychologist figured out that there's some steps that you need to go through, awareness, and then interest, and then consideration, then move to intent, then an evaluation, and then an agreeing to a purchase. And they spent a lot of time, a long time ago, studying this. And it works, and we know why, because it maps exactly to the things you can see you would want to do with those places in the story that your potential customers are going through. Well, we call this a funnel, and there's a danger in that, in the measurement world, in calling something that really has another different model and us trying to make that the model. I can assure you the people going through it are not going through a funnel. They're going through a story. And when we lose sight of exactly what the model steps are, we're missing the nuances of how to continue to move them through. It's more than just keeping track of the numbers that make it to the next step. Is really understanding what those steps are that come from the model. And when you look at other ways to sell, for example, sometimes we want a reactive sell. Okay, I'm in disruption, and I didn't mean to. I was just checking out, but I saw the candy bar, so I didn't really evaluate it or anything. I just wanted a reactive sale. That's in there too. It doesn't really fit into the idea of a funnel, but that's in the story of how it actually happens. Or maybe loyalty. Just take my Visa card, just bill me every month. I just want to be part of this. And at some point, advocacy. So I'm a loyal customer. Why don't you just send me a hat with your logo? I'll wear it around, and all my friends will see that I like your product. And now I become the awareness, the first step for my network, and the story continues with them. That's really what's going on as a story. And this term marketing funnel that measurement people have applied sometimes removes the details of what's really happening, and we lose sight of it because it's not really the model. Now, we've done something similar to that in a bigger way with the models that drives education. So this is sort of came from the B.F. Skinner's work, and he worked in a rat lab and a pigeon lab and figured out you don't really have to understand, you don't have to do all this, that you can just redefine learning as a change of behavior and quickly teach people with programmed instruction, okay? So we use that for education. And the problem is we then had Benjamin Bloom come along, who's an evaluator, not a learning strategist, but an evaluator, who said, we need to evaluate, but we want to start, again, where Skinner did, with this idea that primarily we're memorizers. Primarily, just tell me the steps in automation, I'll memorize that, and then I might work my way up and do other things. And so this is what we have in education. A mismatch of ideas of what we think that taxonomy looks like. And what we realize is going back into his original work, a lot of this you have to go back half a century. In the original work, when we started to move in this direction for our education system, they knew, and people pointed out, you know what, this taxonomy might lead to fragmentation and atomization of the educational purposes. And we know what's being fragmented now. It's story. And the parents that send their kids to the most expensive schools, you look at those schools with the highest scores in critical thinking and problem solving, and all of them are based on problem solving projects and story. And there's a reason. That's because we are wired for story. So it sort of worked for the last half a century. We were in the industrial age. You're just preparing people who are maybe just going to go out and work on the factory floor. But it's not going to work in the AI age. Let's take healthcare. So we collect a lot of metrics around healthcare. That's an entire occupation that runs off of a model that's called SOAP. Okay, there's a subjective and objective measurements, and then assessment, and then you have a plan. So there's some problems that we're having. One is, you can tell it's not a complete advanced organizer. So it's one of the reasons that the training results and training new nurses and doctors is not where it should be. The medical and communication errors is well documented for the last 20 years because they're operating off of a different model, an incomplete model. And now we're using AI to try to automatically categorize all the notes that doctors are taking if you've seen several doctors as a patient, and it can't do it. Of course not. You can't capture all the notes into SOAP. As I say, unless you're McKinsey, your last step can't be plan. Okay, you're obviously doing something after the plan and continuing the story. So when you research this one, similarly, go back a half a century and read the original author of this model in the original paper. He said, SOAP is for the first phase of medical action, which is the collection of data. It was never intended to be the entire clinical process model and documentation process. So I have worked with an MD to complete that cycle of what a clinical process model should be. And we have co-presented that to the VA, and we now have a chapter coming out in an upcoming healthcare book. Okay. Now one more. Let's talk about innovation. So here's MIT again, and this kind of surprised people. They did an extensive review of installations of where design thinking was pushed out, and they said design thinking was supposed to fix the world. Where did it go wrong? Their analysis was looking at the steps that design thinking, again, it's not to pick on any one of these, it's just that there's steps that were given, and it's usually different than the real story. So the steps are empathize, define, ideate, prototype, test, and implement. And their review of the projects using that failed basically for two reasons. One, they said, in general, following steps doesn't lead to innovation. You can bake a cake if I give you the steps, but there's more to it than that. And that over expertise is a problem. You imagine trying to work with someone that's changing the shoes on a horse and empathizing with that. You're not going to invent an automobile. You get too attached at that point. So that was their point. And they concluded, MIT's tech review concluded, design processes themselves need to evolve beyond design thinking. So story thinking has the steps and the map, the directions and the map to go through that, and is used in innovation at, for example, the Knowledge Management Institute. Okay, so listen to all this. Where are you stuck? Is your organization unchallenged? Are you just stuck there in your routine? Or have you moved to disruption? You know something's wrong, but you're blustering and you're stuck there. Or you've moved into investigation, but you're in analysis paralysis because you're stuck there. Or you realize that there's some ideas and you move into ideation and you realize there's 100 ways you could do it and you're stuck dithering and so forth. So identify your organization's weakest capability, okay, and identify the data and visualization of the data needed to strengthen it, And as Edward Tufte would say in this process, if the statistics are boring, then you've got the wrong numbers. They should align with how you get unstuck, and that should be exciting. All right, here's another data strategy in the new world of prompts. You probably have a prompt that looks something like this. Analyze the trends in monthly sales data over the last 2 years, identify any patterns and anomalies and so forth. But do you have a prompt that sounds like this? Create a report for the innovation projects in the portfolio and so forth. Review the top 200 search intents for the answers on the website. We want to know when the answers we're providing are what people think is the real answer. Monitor inventory levels, identify items and so forth, and show fraud detection, okay? So the idea of this is just saying, think of story when you're thinking of prompts. Does your collection all land in one place, or have you identified the metrics that are really needed for your entire story? So here's some success measurements and common failures. What we're looking for is proficient routines, not workarounds as the norms. Being prepared for solutions and disruption, not waiting for disruption. Finding root causes, not ungrounded assumptions. Ingenuity and attainability in ideation, not creativity for its own sake. Clear project expectations versus sticking with a bad plan, and achieving your project goals, but lessons never learned or shared. This is what we're after, and as soon as you tell me the answer to all of these, there's one more question. How do you know? How do you know? This is the most neglected data point in our organization. It's not what we know. We have a lot of what we know. The question is, how do you know? How do you know? And again, story can help us with that, because when we look at narrative intelligence and the requirement for internal consistency, the reason I might give you is just reaction. It's a habit. I was trained to do that, and that's the reason I give you. Or citing someone, a citation. Authorities said to do this. The protocol is to do that. Associations, connections. By definition, through deduction, I know A and B, that means I know C. No, it means you deduce C. We don't know if it means we know C. Abduction, that's an interesting one. I already know the answer I want. I'll see if I can go find some proof and hypothesis to support it. Succession, process and outcomes. Inspection, induction, which is the way we should identify a hypothesis and test for it, and motivation, setting a goal, or the entire inference structure of narration, which holds them together. And all of these should be held together in internal consistency. Now, the question is, what reasons do you hear? When I go into organizations and I listen for all, I come back and I give them a report on the reason count that they give in their organization, and most of the time it looks like this. Most people are just saying, for the most part, here's why. I was told to, that's what it says to do, and citation is the biggest answer. So let's ask it this way. What's the reason we should accept? What's the reason we should accept? Is it really just someone told me? Because if it is, we have a problem with this next question. And everyone in this room, somewhere in the back of your mind in the last year, has asked this question. Will humanity be the master or slave of AI? And if we're only saying someone said, we're just going to replace someone with AI. AI said. And now we know the answer to this question. So it's a pretty dim view if this is the direction we're going. But something exciting happened not long ago. In January with DeepSeek saying, you don't have to think in terms of just saying, here's the answer. If you're AI, you can say, let me show you my reasoning. And out of the blue came some hope. Out of the blue, we have a new way of thinking about what AI can do. And some people have said, no, it's not out of the blue. That's not the point. It's out of the red. Do you get it? A communist location, the human spirit said, giving me the answer even here is not okay. We are wired for story. We need the whole story. It showed the whole free world the way forward. So how did other LLM companies respond to this? Well, some of them have continued on that path, showing us thinking, but some of them have not really focused on displaying the reasoning. They just make me wait 5 minutes for the answer and say, it's a reasoning model. Now here's the answer you can cite. So this is something we have to collectively work against and not let them just move us in that direction to get the answer that we want. We won't be the master, but we can at least be a coworker. All right, quick summary. Storytelling is a powerful communication strategy. Yes, it is. We're wired for it. And when you realize that you are in a story, it will change how you design and measure your work. It's called storytelling in now time. I call it story thinking. And I'll conclude with a quote from the great Deming, who said, "We will never transform the prevailing system of management without transforming our prevailing system of education." They are the same system. And I believe that Deming was describing this system that's called story. With that, thank you. Enjoy the conference.